Hi, I'm Tom and I'm a tenants advocate at the Inner Sydney Tenants Advice and Advocacy Service, part of the Redfern Legal Centre. This video is about terminations in social housing. There are two ways in which a tenancy can be terminated. The first is if a tenant voluntarily moves out, and the second is by order of the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Usually, the first formal step in terminating a tenancy will be the social housing provider giving the tenant a termination notice. Some of the common reasons that providers issue termination notices are because the provider believes that the tenant has breached their tenancy agreement, that the tenant has fallen more than 14 days behind in their rent, which is also a breach of the tenancy agreement, or the provider believes that the tenant is no longer eligible to be housed with them. There are rules about what information should be contained in a termination notice, how the termination notice should be given to a tenant, and the minimum number of days that a tenant has to move out. The most important thing to know about a termination notice is that it does not automatically end a tenancy. It's just the first step in a legal process. A tenant is completely within their rights to not move out in accordance with a termination notice. If a tenant doesn't move out in accordance with a termination notice, it's up to the social housing provider to make an application to the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal for a termination order. This means that the tenant will have a chance to put their case to stay at a hearing at the tribunal. If certain serious allegations are made against the tenant, the housing provider can skip the termination notice and apply directly to the tribunal. We're talking here about allegations like that the tenant has used the property for an illegal purpose, or that the tenant has made a serious threat against an employee of the provider or a neighbour, for example. There are special rules that apply when a termination is about rent arrears. In these cases, tenants will sometimes be able to enter into a repayment plan, and some of the time, if the tenant pays all of the rent owing, the termination action stops automatically. It's worth briefly mentioning strike notices in social housing terminations. In New South Wales, social housing providers can now issue tenants with strike notices if they believe there's been a breach of the agreement. The third strike notice is a termination notice. If a tenant receives a strike notice or a warning they're about to receive a strike notice, it's crucial that the tenant responds to it quite quickly. If a termination notice is given, it may be too late to do anything about the earlier strike notices, even if the housing provider got it wrong at the time. A tenants advocate can advise you about tenants' rights when it comes to terminations.